Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for attending. My name is Mike Weaver, and I'm one of the product owners here at Quadratech. Here at Quadratech, I oversee our tenant-to-tenant migration products, so this is a topic I'm really excited to talk to you today and share some of the tips we have on these very complex projects. Before we get started, there are just a couple things to run through. For optimal listening for everyone, all lines are currently muted and will be throughout the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to us using the questions feature on the right toolbar. We are going to be handling Q&A a little differently today because this topic has generated a lot of interest, so stand by for more on that. This session is being recorded and a link will be shared to all registered attendees in the next day or so. With all that, allow me to introduce our CTO and Microsoft MVP, Paul Robichaux, who's going to go over our agenda for today's webinar. Paul, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good, Mike. Thanks. How are you?
Good.
Good. All right. So for today's webinar, I want to reserve the bulk of the time for Mike to talk about tenant to tenant. This is his jam, right? He is our director of enterprise migrations and the man who makes Cloud Commander do all the really cool stuff that it does. But before we get there, we have some ground setting and boundaries to lay out. I'm going to spend a very short amount of time talking about who Quadratech is and what we do. And then for the rest of the presentation, we're going to be talking about the key elements that you need to be considering when you do tenant migration. Starting with how you figure out which tenants to migrate when, assuming that you've got more than two of them, finding the right cadence for your project, understanding the real costs of delay that you are likely to face if your migration is delayed or put off track, whether it's because of factors you control or factors you don't control. Either way, you have to understand what that impact is. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about how we're going to follow this webinar up with a live office hours sort of Q&A. So when you think about what Quadratech is and what we do, we started as a migration company. We earned our spurs in the very early on-prem exchange market, moving people's legacy archive data out of systems like Enterprise Vault and Source One into on-prem archives. As the market has grown, as cloud archiving has become a thing, as people have continued to want to get rid of PSTs, we've continued to grow into this first pillar of modernizing people's infrastructure by helping them migrate their data to where it needs to go. Over the last couple of years, we've seen steady motion of people wanting to grow and adapt their Office 365 environments, in particular by doing cloud-to-cloud and tenant-to-tenant migrations. This is an area, frankly, where Microsoft has just sort of ignored their customers' needs. They don't have any tools for doing this. They are working on them, but when they ship them, they'll ship them. Everything is subject to change. But business can't wait. Our customers every day are having merger, acquisition, divestiture activity that is required to keep their businesses competitive, and we want to support that. But whether or not you have migration, whether or not you have cloud-to-cloud migration requirements, we also are a significant player in the Office 365 management space. We built that under the banner of what we call Nova, our integrated management platform, which is built on top of our prior Radar and Autopilot products. So we come to the Office 365 space with this common basis of helping you modernize what you already have if you want to, giving you the tools to grow and adapt your business around Office 365, whether that's with one tenant or many, and then optimizing and managing however many tenants you end up with on an ongoing basis. So the key thing to think about, and I'm throwing a little bit of shade at Microsoft, but I think it's fair to say it's deserved in this case. Office 365 was never designed to be a multi-tenant organization or to support multi-tenant organizations in the way we think of them. Now, of course, Microsoft has supported multi-tenant for a long time. There used to be a tool set called the Hosted Exchange toolset. It was originally made to make on-prem Exchange capable of supporting something that looked sort of like Office 365 tenants. But on the service provider side, having multiple tenants is completely different than having multiple tenants on the management side. So Microsoft has got all these tools and infrastructure that they built Office 365 around to let them support hundreds of thousands or millions of individual segregated Office 365 tenants. But they don't give us the tools to move data between those tenants very effectively. We only are just now getting the basics of moving mailboxes between tenants. But that ignores all the other data and metadata that you probably have in your tenants that you need to keep. You can't combine things or collapse them. It's very difficult to identify. and set boundaries around data that you want to keep in one tenant versus data you want moved into another tenant. And although Microsoft has said they are working on this, they haven't said publicly what exactly they're working on or when they will have it ready for the rest of us to use. And like I said before, business is not waiting. Everybody on this call has got merger and acquisition or divestiture requirements that they need to meet. And Microsoft isn't able to help you meet them at this point in time. So let's pivot really abruptly from talking about the space to starting to talk about the practical considerations involved in tenant to tenant. Mike, I'm going to let you start that off by talking to people about how do you decide if you have multiple tenants that need to be consolidated or migrated? You've got to pick one. How do you pick your favorite child when you're going through this process?
Certainly, picking the favorite is not easy. So I think a good way to start the discussion here, and for those that are following us today that don't have multiple tenants, a lot of what we're going to talk about still applies, but certainly we're going to talk about how having multiple tenant amplifies this problem. But let's go ahead and review that single tenant to tenant process that we recommend clients go through when we're starting to undertake one of these projects. So when we talk about merger, acquisition, and divestitures, and really any project, it's all about planning. And you're going to hear today a lot of advice and things to look at in your planning process for your tenant-to-tenant migration. But when you look at a normal tenant-to-tenant process, this is kind of the steps that we see everybody go through. Analyzing and scoping the project. I'm going to kind of skip this for a moment because I'm going to give you everything to look at, but really understanding the problem, understanding the situation, and getting ready for the project is just kind of that base step that everyone needs to take for anything. We're going to talk about resolving conflicts. So when we're talking about conflicts, it can be all sorts of things from configuration conflicts, from name conflicts, to all these things that kind of get in the way of the project. We're going to talk about wave planning. We're going to talk about how breaking people down into user waves or the decision to move into one very large wave. We have a story that we put on the website of doing a 15,000 user migration in one weekend. The trends are starting to change to doing these larger and larger migration groups as the technology has gotten better. So things to keep in mind in those planning phases. In the execution, we're going to talk about, how you migrate and finalize and those aspects of it. And certainly, I think in the grand scheme, particularly with multi-tenant migrations, the actual moving of data is pretty well covered. It's just everything that goes around it. And so hopefully we'll be able to put people at ease today in what we see. And then always don't forget you need a decommissioning plan. And the decommissioning plan needs to be part of your scoping at the beginning so that you can effectively turn things off. And a lot of people may think that's just simply deleting the tenant, but do keep in mind you've got things like legal hold and all these other things that you need to plan for before you can just simply decommission the tenant. But let's talk about the major things that get in the way when we're talking about doing multiple tenant migrations. And we've got business challenges and we've got technology challenges. On the technology front, we've got problems where our organization probably doesn't have a ton of experts just sitting around with this expertise that have this knowledge. We probably in larger companies have a couple people that have done migration work, but certainly the tenant-tenant space, although evolving, continues to be new. When we talk about doing multiple projects, that same person probably can't stop doing all of the things that they're doing today and dedicate themselves to doing a multi-tenant migration project for however long it takes to get this done, depending on how many tenants you have. The other aspect is identity management. Paul's got a great section that he's going to go into in a few minutes on that, but that takes a lot of planning, and that can have a lot of limiting factors and really dictate what happens here. There can be multiple types of source systems. Today we're talking about Office 365 as a source and target, but we do have situations where a company acquiring may be on G Suite or Lotus Notes or some other technology, and that makes this more complicated. Internal and external sharing, and this is using just traditional OneDrive for Business sharing or just other challenges around sharing and collaboration. And a new one, or not really say a new one, but one we're going to talk about of internal external sharing in the same item where the tenants and the sources are collaborating with each other. So that's really external sharing from the Office 365 perspective, but that's a company that we own and how that can make things more difficult. For the business side, we've got to plan around competing busy and slow periods. So we've got Easter weekend coming up, and so can we use that weekend to migrate? Well, for half our business, that's great, and for the other half of our business, that's really bad. So how do we move the business as one when we've got these competing interests? The other problem is the integration can be very difficult. So why was this project done in the first place? Why did we have this acquisition? And what is the business driver and how is that affecting the integration? Reorgs are commonplace. Very rarely do companies buy a firm and keep them over at arm's length and not integrate. You know, that investment was made for good reason. So reorgs in the middle of these projects are very common. And then, you know, you've got other activity that's going to happen at the same time. So reorgs happen, but other acquisitions are going to happen. You're going to have other segmentations, or you're going to combine certain divisions. You may spin out certain divisions, but all that can be really challenging. So what can we do? At a base level, we want to get as much data as possible so we can make data-driven decisions. And on the outside, that sounds very basic, but as we dive into this in the space, it gets really, really complicated. So the first thing is we want to talk about is business data. We're going to talk later about having a good project sponsor, but to as much as we can, we need to understand what the business is doing and what their drivers are. When we have multiple tenants, this is really complicated. But we also want to avoid situations like we integrated this tenant and we're divesting it, and other challenges. We want to avoid the problem where, you know, in December we're going to do a product launch, and right now it's April, so this is the right time to integrate that tenant so that we're not doing an integration while they're trying to do a product launch. All those things go into the integration team really needs to be brought in and understand what the business is doing. And again, understanding business and quiet periods. When we look at technology data, we really need to understand what is going on with volumes of data and number of users at the very basic. But using our Nova platform, we scope these tenants. So when you've got 10, 20, 30, records 120 tenants that you need to scope for an integration project, you need a platform that can help you get this information quickly. But this goes so much more than just volumes of data and number of users. We need to look at what systems are being used, what applications are being used. Do we have licensing mismatch? Are there a couple E5s out there and E3 is our standard on the target? We can use this to try to find some shadow IT so that we can try to bring everyone into the same platform. Maybe there's some Slack going on, but we are all on Teams and want to integrate that way. And also finding how users interact across the systems. That allows us to understand where we're going to have to put some focus in and group tenants together. If we see a lot of collaboration amongst these three small tenants, well, then it probably makes sense to move those three small tenants together in the same weekend rather than interrupt users multiple times in the collaboration that they have. The other thing that I can't stress enough is doing interviews and engaging power users and administrators in doing these interviews. A great example is, when you see something funky in the reporting, so the example I have here, in our analysis, you own this SharePoint site that has 1,000 people with external access. What are you doing? How are you using this? And then not only do you need to plan the migration for them, but is there going to be a different system in the end state? So a lot of organizations call it application mapping, but mapping process and applications across the board. Just because it's both the source and target are on Office 365, you may find the mapping different for what they're using in the source and what they're going to use on the target. When it comes to planning your multi-tenant schedule, the best way that we have found to do it is to do an in-person facilitation session. And that can be really hard in our global world, but this is really, as we found, particularly if you've got 3 or 4 tenants, you might be able to do it, in a couple hour or even remote. But when we're talking about, 10, 15, 20 tenants, you really need to bring everyone together. And what we do is we create these little cards, literally sheets of paper or cards that have tenant information. I'll show you an example on the next slide. And it gives all the high-level information on the tenant. We then take our agreed timeline. So if we want to agree that in 2020 we're going to complete this project, I would probably do month columns and put literally month columns down on the table. And then we define how much we can handle and what our project cadence is going to be. So we can move 3 large tenants, 2 small tenants, and a medium in this month, and start putting cards into those categories. What's extremely important is on the back, we take notes of why tenants were placed, because it's really not uncommon to have delay in this space. We're going to talk about the cost of delay at the end of this, but we want to know why tenants were placed where they were in the scheduling by the people that are in the session. And that's so that if we suddenly have to delay the whole project 60 days, we know, can we move all the tenants 60 days, or were certain tenants placed in certain places because they had to have certain timing. The cards themselves, this is what I've used before. And so in the upper right-hand corner, we've got priority and size. So priority is usually you do have some sort of mandate from your leadership on, we really want these pieces of business to go as soon as possible. The size is a small, large, extra large, medium, whatever size, and I'll show what we used for classification in the next slide. And that's just the starting place so that you have a relative indicator of how complex this tenant is. On it, we then have size information and complexity information to be able to understand right in the session very easily how big it is. So this is things like you see the size of the exchange workload, how many distribution lists. A lot of this is exchange data because that's usually critical path, but OneDrive for business data, number of SharePoint sites, and you may find there's other items that you need based on your organization. Maybe you have a lot of Office 365 groups, whatever it may be, or there's a certain technology that they use that you have to track. Whatever it may be, you want to ensure that they're on these cards. And you want to note, usually on the back also, I put all the SMTP domains for that tenant so that sometimes people know the brand of the domain and in the session and not necessarily the name of the tenant. We want to ensure that size for this exercise is a combined and comparative score. So one organization's medium tenant is going to be another organization's small tenant. So you want to ensure that for you that these are comparative and combined. You just can't say, 500 across the board is always going to be my small tenant. Then what we would do is we would help classify these by complexity. So for example, if there's not a lot of users, but they have every single service that they're using in that tenant, they may not be a small tenant, they may be a medium tenant. So this is really gauging effort for the migration. So some examples too that might go into your exercise are timeline. So summer is a really busy season for that group of business, so we can't migrate them in the summer. Or please avoid Chinese New Year for that group of business. So particularly international companies, certain holidays come into play and other challenges that have to be addressed as part of the planning. These are really good examples of things that you want to track from this session. So again, you have that information. So if you need to move a tenant, you know why they were placed there. One more note on the facilitation session, and what you've really got to keep in mind is usage versus volume. Both are important. So volume takes time. So I've got 100 terabytes of data. It's going to take me 100 hours to move that 100 terabytes because we've got some really good speed lately. But that can be handled by technology. As a migration team, I know how long it takes to move data. What gets complex is a user impact based on usage. And that is one thing that is really important in gauging the size of these tenants is understanding that usage information. So again, high volumes of data that are used often are a difficult combination, but high volumes of data that aren't used often are not as difficult to handle. So with that, Paul, why don't we pick up identity, which is always a really difficult topic in this.
Yes, identity management in multi-tenant consolidations and divestitures just makes me want to drink, right? It's a super complicated problem. And it's one where the tools to manage it are, if anything, even less evolved than the tools that Microsoft gives us for managing data. As long as you keep in mind this fundamental truth, which is that identity is the bedrock of everything that you do in the migration, because you can't migrate any data, any metadata, any objects, anything, unless and until you have an identity assigned in the target. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the traditional migration strategy that people have used for things like IMAP migrations or very small tenant to tenant or server to server migrations back in like the Exchange 5.5 and Exchange 2000 days, people would say things like, oh, I'm just going to export all my mailboxes to PST files. Okay, well, you can do that because PST is just a dumb container. It's not associated with an identity. So if I have a PST that came from Mike's mailbox, I can open it in my Outlook client and I can attach to it and have that mail data. But in Office 365, we can't do that anymore. So before I can migrate Mike's account from the Contoso tenant to the Fabricam tenant, I have to have an account in the Fabricam tenant to hold Mike's stuff. That's really what it comes down to. So you can't migrate data without having an identity to associate with it. What that means for you as a practical matter is that having the ability to identify, inventory, map, synchronize, and manage the identities between your source tenants, however many of them there are, and the target tenants, how many of them there are, is really, really important. There are a lot of different ways to do this, and we don't have enough time in the webinar to cover even half of them. I'll give you some examples based on things we have seen our customers do. We have seen customers who said, you know what, we have 5 existing tenants, and we're consolidating them into a single tenant. We're going to give everybody, when we migrate them, a brand new identity with a new naming standard in the new tenant. That's a perfectly valid thing to do. It gets very complicated to do that past a certain number of users, but it is a thing you could do. We've had other customers who have done things like build a really complicated, and Mike is intimately familiar with the details of this project, a really complicated system based on Okta, which is a third-party authentication system that they were already using, to synchronize all of the individual tenants through Okta to a single Active Directory forest, which they then synchronized with Office 365. That's a thing that you could do too. At the end of the day, the requirement is you have to have an identity to hold the stuff before you can migrate it. And so understanding how you're going to go about doing that before you start trying to plan or execute the migration is really critical. The problem with this is that there are fairly substantial penalties for getting it wrong. Mike likes to tell the story about when he flies from the UK back to the US, there's at least one other person named Mike Weaver. That's not a big surprise. Unfortunately, one of the other Mike Weavers is wanted by the US federal government. So pretty much every time Mike goes through JFK, he gets detained, at least for a short while they figure out that this Mike Weaver is not the same Mike Weaver as the one that the cops are looking for. Every time. It gets tiresome after a while. But in a more serious context for 365 migrations and tenant to tenant work, you also have to deal with the fact that as the migration manager, right, as a person who's executing the migration, you may not have enough metadata to be able to tell the difference between the 2 Mike Weavers, or John Smith, who is the CEO and has an email address of john.smith, and John Smith, the security guard, who is john.smith2, right? So having a broader contextual understanding of where these identities are, how they are organized into organizational units or groups, how those OUs or groups fit into the business context of the overall migration is really, really important, because without that, you can't plan your identity strategy. Without an identity strategy, you won't be migrating anything. So how are you going to actually migrate the identities? There's a lot I could say here about various tools to do it. I'll be really transparent and straightforward and say, Quadratec's tools don't do this. That's because there are so many different ways to do it, and the right way is going to be so sensitive to your internal environment, what you already have deployed, what your political and business requirements are, that we don't feel like we could do a good job of trying to be all things to all people. So our approach is to say, really what you're talking about doing when you're migrating identity, you're talking about migrating or synchronizing some set of properties that are associated with each of the source objects with an object in the target. However you choose to do that is okay with us. You can do it, for example, by hiring Microsoft consulting services for a very reasonable, I think $5,000 per tenant per month fee. to synchronize your multiple tenants into a single target for you using MIM. There are a number of other third-party tools that will do that. You can try to do it yourself. At the end of the day, what we want is we want to see those identities being correctly synchronized with the right properties so that we can use them as anchors to decide that this John Smith over here should be mapped to that John Smith over there. Now, Mike can go into more detail about this in our office hours session, but one of the things that we think distinguishes our products is that we have a very flexible set of tools for mapping these permissions and identities across and between tenants. So you can say, okay, this John Smith over here should have the following permissions in the target tenant and should have the following permissions on this set of OneDrive or SharePoint objects, just to cite one example. But keep in mind that as part of this process, there are a whole bunch of other constraints around identity that you have to satisfy that we're going to talk about in our section on trying to find the right cadence. So Mike, I think with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to you.
Sure thing.
Oh, no, sorry. I'm sorry. I've got one more slide. My mistake. I need more coffee. Last problem that I'll talk about here is that multi-sync is tougher than a lot of people realize. So the problem that you have here is if you're migrating one tenant into another, let's say that, I don't know, Disney buys Fox and you need to migrate all of the Fox content and people into the Disney tenant. I mean, that's a large scale problem. There are a lot of users and PST files and stuff in the Fox tenant, but it's tractable. You can at least sort of get your arms around it. It's a much bigger problem when you have companies that have historically tended to grow through M&A, where they're not just doing one big bang M&A like Amazon Whole Foods or United Technologies and Raytheon. You're doing a bunch of them where one company is buying 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 companies a year, year in, year out. And all of a sudden now they need to migrate between tenants. If you think about the multi-sync strategies that you can adopt, one thing that we see a lot, because it works well and it's less painful than some of the other alternatives, is to just give everybody in the new tenant, assuming that you're migrating a bunch of existing tenants into a single consolidated tenant, you give everybody a new greenfield identity and then you map from the source tenant to the greenfield. Now, another way that you can do that, and this works well in large organizations where you couldn't migrate everybody quickly anyway because you have other business constraints, is to say, okay, first I'm going to migrate everybody in tenant A into the consolidated tenant. Meanwhile, tenants B, C, D, E, F, G, et cetera, they stay, you leave them alone. When you're done with A, you move B. When you're done with B, you move C. There are all kinds of tricks that you can do to parallelize certain aspects of these kinds of migrations. But you run into some potential problems where you have guest relationships or shared permissions or other organizational links that you then need to respect. Okay, it's a fascinating topic. There are all kinds of individual edge cases that you can run into. And the thing about edge cases, like the edge of a knife, is sometimes they're sharp and they cut you. So now it's Mike's turn.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate it. Identity certainly is one of the largest challenges for these projects. And as you said, it's always environment by environment. So it's more picking the right solution for your situation more so than, here's the magic sauce that covers everything. So in this section, we're going to talk about finding project cadence. And this is a really important topic because I talked about the tenant ordering, Paul's talked about identity, but now when you've got multiple tenants, you kind of got to answer the question, how fast can I go? And there's 3 major limitations that are a lot larger that we're going to go into here that kind of, bring things together. So, we're using gears and the engine to bring it together here, but it's technical limitations, people and business change, and project challenges. And these are kind of the 3 things that really drive how fast a project can go. So we're going to review some tips in each of these areas to help be more successful and get everything going in the right direction. The first are technical limitations, and tech limitations are there, but this is admittedly, again, the easier of the two to deal with because we can plan for them and in a lot of cases are a little more consistent. Speed of data migrations. So, there's certainly been some activity on our site recently on the speed that we can hit in our solutions, but not every workload can run that fast. And there are other items in the tenant that may need to migrate that have limitations. So identity is a great example. It takes so long to eject a domain and import it. How many of those can I do? If I've got 100 domains in one tenant, can I really do that in an overnight window? Things like that. The end state agreement. That sounds pretty basic, but I'm going to talk about how that goes over into a people challenge is agreement on what the end configuration is. A lot of people, when we, used to really be panicked in the on-prem days of mapping on-prem and systems to each other because there was a variety, a lot of people feel now because you're on Office 365, it's easy, but what we lose track of is there's so much configuration and option in the product that that's an agreement in itself and a migration in itself of what the final end state's going to be. Something that kind of falls into that category is license mismatch. So if I'm trying to have everyone on a standard E3 and I've got E5 in the source, what is that going to break and how am I going to map people over? So commonly people are on E5 for phone features. What's my phone solution in the target tenant and how do I migrate people over to it? Another aspect is client reconfiguration. If I'm not replacing all the devices, I've got to reconfigure that client. How am I going to do that? A lot of times there's a agent on software solutions, including ours, to help deal with that. But that also can only go so far. So a lot of times a remediation that has to be done in the target tenant post-move can be a difficult piece. A great example is, let's say I've got a Power BI dashboard in SharePoint that pulls certain information out of Salesforce. Well, I'm going to migrate it. It's going to be available in the target, but somebody's got to reset up the tie-in because the credentials for the Salesforce connector don't come over. So that's a good example of some manual work that may need to be done. And then there's some items that don't move, and I've got kind of the warning list here, but there's just some items that, as we talked about at the beginning, Microsoft didn't build the service to migrate. So there's certain aspects of this that do not migrate. When we talk about project challenges, these are hard projects to manage. And for, a project manager makes everything happen when it comes to these kinds of organizations and challenges and projects. And you really need a program, and I'll talk about what a program looks like in a minute. But you also need to be realistic. There's going to be issues. And a lot of times for a company's first tenant-to-tenant project, they aren't aware of how much more effort this kind of project takes than your traditional on-prem integration. There's other things that you have to be aware of. Some of the things like system outages, either within the migration or somewhere else, and it takes people's focus off of it. We have some projects on hold right now for a week or so because there's really high load right now in the Teams environment. And so needing to do very large data migrations across the Teams service has been a little challenging for us right now. But that can happen to other systems as well. The other problem is resource availability and single points of failure. So again, we mentioned at the beginning, when you've got a multi-tenant project, you only have so much staff that has this expert knowledge. And in some organizations, you may only have one, or you may need to acquire that knowledge. If that person isn't available, that's a problem. If that person can't work every weekend, that's a problem. That person goes on vacation, gets sick, gets hit by a bus, whatever may happen, that can put the whole project in the way. So you really need to identify these key people up front and ensure that you have backup systems in place for that person so that the projects can stay on track. And again, that goes back to being realistic and communicating realistic expectations. We can also talk about project fatigue and change tolerance. People can only handle so much. And if every weekend is a crisis, that doesn't work. And if every weekend something's changing, that doesn't work. And so those can be really difficult things for a project management team to help combat. We talked about target configuration. That is something that has to be handled in that analyze and scope phase. and needs to be planned for. Obviously, in an M&A, if you're 10,000 people and you bought a company with 40 people, they're going to probably adopt your end state. But when we see in these multi-tenant migrations, if you've got 10 companies moving and 8 of them are on one set of standard and the target is on another, well, maybe we've got to change the setting. And why is it set that way? So that is an entire process, is agreeing to what the end state is. Another aspect is help desk staffing. When it comes Monday morning and all those users log in, they're going to need to reconfigure their mobile device. The reconfiguration agent's going to work, but there still might be some stuff that doesn't migrate correctly. They're going to need access to people. So having a help desk and access to bring in extra people and be able to handle that is really important. And again, a very large project challenge. But then we have the business and people change problems. And really, this is a change management exercise. We've got a really good series on our website called Method to the Madness that I was really happy to do with a change management specialist, MJ Flanagan. And she helped us with this framework to help organizations through the challenges of major change, but it was focused for the merger, acquisition, and divestiture space. So understanding all these aspects that are impacted through this kind of change is really important. One of the items that's common is there's a reorg mid-project. So do I plan for that? I've been part of projects where they reorg the migration team first with usually HR so that that team could work on the integration together and have that done so that they could support the rest of the business. So there's things like that that can be very helpful and effective. There can be changes in leadership and direction in the middle of the project. So suddenly we've got to integrate this company and now we've got to integrate another. And that one's more important now, so we got to focus on that one, being able to react to that. Product launches. We bought them for a reason. Why did we? That's important for the planning aspect so that we can ensure that we meet those needs. Another thing is communications, and that's part of change management, as we all know. There's a really good set of communication templates, again, on our website that I really would recommend taking a look at. It's actually one of our most popular downloads to help organizations through that aspect. And again, help desk needs, but more importantly, the tolerance for IT change. So this is where it can really be a problem for organizations that every week somebody moves and now they can't get access to my OneDrive, and now I've got to reshare it every Monday morning. Issues around that. So to kind of start bringing this topic together, really we want to talk about effective planning for effective outcomes. And here are kind of the top tips from our projects to bring it all together. Look at every single tenant migration as multiple projects in one. Each workload, the identity, security settings, everything. Each one of those is a mini project. You have to have an effective program that's repeatable for multi-tenant projects. If it's 5 projects for one tenant, it's going to be 15 for 2 tenants. It's not linear, it's exponential. And the issues get really more and more complex. And the 2 major things are understanding the cross-pollination, so how users are collaborating across all of the different tenants, and understanding your single points of failure in people, because you only have access to so many experts that can do this. Another key tip is have a consistent business sponsor that's a senior level and has CEO buy-in. This is a difficult project and it has to have CEO buy-in for it to be effective. You also need to have a proper consolidation program, as we talked about. And in that, you need to have open, honest communication and set proper expectations up front. You don't want to tell users that this was super simple and then it isn't, and that can be a problem. And most organizations are going to need some help from outside firms, and that can be, whether change management or some of the technical experts. And Paul, I think this is yours.
Yeah, this is. I just had to take myself off mute. So it's really important that you give thought to the full scope of all the data you have. We have run into this time and again where we go talk to a customer and they say, yeah, we're not using fill in the blank. We're not using Power BI. They get ready to start their migration and oops, it turns out that some critical part of the finance team is in fact using Power BI, and they go running to somebody very high up in the organizational chain saying, look, this migration is going to break a critical business process because we won't have Power BI. Then that's when the fight starts, right? So it's really important to make sure that you have a good understanding of how or if these workloads are actually being used in all of your source tenants, because right now, most of them can't be migrated. Okay, there are manual tools for migrating planner data, but for Power BI, as an example, there are no automated tools, there's no migration API, nobody supports migration of Power BI because there's no automated way to do it. Same problem with Yammer. You probably could Cajun engineer a solution to migrate Azure application registrations, but I wouldn't if I were you, because you need to have good oversight over which applications are being authorized and consented in your new tenant. Custom SharePoint applications, stream data, there are probably others, right? If you have any kind of custom line of business applications or data that you built on top of or around Office 365, Teams bots being a good example, you need to understand where they are, where they're used, what the impact is if you don't migrate them, and whether that impact is going to dictate a change in your cadence or in your planning. Now, it's usually okay, as long as you know that things can't be migrated, it's usually okay to surface that and say, hey, you know what? We can't migrate Power BI. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? Well, that's a business problem. It's not Mike the migrator's issue necessarily. And so as the person driving the migration, those of you on the call may not end up getting stuck with the remediation, but you don't ever want to be the one to have to respond to these kinds of problems as opposed to identifying them at the beginning of your migration.
All right, and I think we're gonna wrap it up here with the cost of delay. And what we really want to point out here is all of the planning goes into keeping your project on track. But what you have to keep track of in M&A activity is if your integration project gets delayed, this impacts several other projects. And this can really add up in cost. If you're a Gartner customer, there's a really good article out here, referenced here, that talks about the cost of delay. And it's really important to understand how in the M&A space, this can have a really direct impact to the return on these investments. So you can do either more in M&A or move your company forward. When we talk about this, there's direct costs and indirect costs that need to come into account here. So when we talk about direct costs to the integration project, we've got things like consulting extensions, project management extensions, software agreements and maintenance, and the cost to maintain and operate these two systems. So those are kind of when we think of delaying a integration project that hit here. But the really expensive ones are the indirect cost, and these are the projects that we kind of ricochet and push behind, so we can't launch that product on time, and these other projects didn't happen because of that. And it just really, really expands from there. The other problem are productivity costs. Productivity is always hard to pin and put a dollar amount on, but that is really a real issue there. And again, it can delay the next integration project, and it continues. So it's really important in this space where it's prone to have project delay to really keep an eye on it and plan and scope your projects as much as possible so that we can prevent that. So with that, Paul, for our Q&A session, we're going to do things a little differently this time. Do you want to describe what we're going to do next week?
Yeah, so one of the things we've seen, as you might expect, huge upsurge in people using Teams. We still use GoToWebinar for these kinds of events because it's the platform we have, but writing's on the wall, right? Teams is the way to go. But more importantly, for webinars like this, one of the things we always find, people have very detailed questions that we just can't dig into in the short amount of time we typically have because they're follow-ups, and GoToWebinar doesn't make it easy to have an interactive conversation. So we're going to try something different for a follow-up this webinar. All the attendees from this session are going to get an email, which is an invitation to a Teams meeting that Mike and I are going to host. The whole purpose of that Teams meeting is for you to bring your environment-specific tenant-to-tenant consolidation questions to us to answer. Now, I should mention, I didn't say anything about divestiture because Mike has another webinar next week just talking about divestiture, and we'll do a follow-up Q&A session for that. But the idea behind this office hours is for you to be able to interact directly with us, ask your technical or process questions, and get detailed enough answers to be useful instead of just having the presenter say, oh yeah, that's a good question, and give a 30-second soundbite and then move on. So look for that. We'll make the recording available as well for people who are not able to attend the Q&A. But we'll try this as an experiment and see how it goes. We look forward to seeing you there.
Great. I'm excited for that next week. The other thing is note, if you've got these tenant challenges, next week's going to be a great opportunity. If you do have a project though that you need some additional help with, this is something that we do a lot of right now. So certainly visit our website here to get more information or reach out. We certainly, in these complex projects, have a lot to offer. The other aspect is we have our new and improved MAD content hub. So if you need some other information, perhaps around project management or change management, we've got a really good set of content that's available there on the link provided. And as Paul mentioned, I'm going to be doing a session on divestitures, how to manage your breakup, on April 21st. So if you're here for a divestiture or that's something that you keep running into, how to spin off a set of users, that's going to be a great opportunity as well. So otherwise, Paul, thanks for a great session, and I'm really looking forward to an interactive Q&A next week.
Thanks, Mike. Good stuff. And thanks to everybody for joining us. See you at the Q&A.